continuing with our series to welcome in the new year by welcoming some new ideas that were inspired by a book called The Big Picture by Caltech theoretical physicist Sean Carroll. The big new idea in The Big Picture is something that he calls poetic naturalism. Naturalism is the way of science and the way of the scientific method. And the operation of those natural laws, those scientific laws, is unavoidable. And the fact is that scientific, natural reality can be harsh, or maybe we might say uncompromising. However, we human beings can bring something unique and valuable to that uncompromising reality. Poetic naturalism is what helps us to complete the picture. We accept the knowledge, we embrace the benefits of the scientific method, but we also bring it into the realm of goodness, beauty, values, ethics, and intangibles like that. That's the poetic side of it. We can bring meaning, purpose, justice, beauty, and things like that. Which brings us to our topic for today, an aspect of reality that seems rather uncompromising and harsh at times, an aspect of reality that we sometimes struggle with: time. Ancient proverb says that time and tide wait for no man. No one is so powerful that they can resist or prevent the march of time or the ebb and the flow of the tides. So that scientific natural reality tells us that there are two things primarily that happen with the passage of time. Two things happen. One is that there are predictable cycles. There are things that repeat themselves, like a quartz crystal vibrating. It vibrates so precisely and so repetitively that we use it to regulate timepieces. Or we have the cycles of the calendar, the days, the seasons. We kind of like those things, don't we? Huh? Everybody has their favorite season, and we know that our favorite season will always come around again. That day will follow night. But unfortunately, not all of the seasons of life are like that, because the second thing that happens with the passage of time are the things that change and never go back to the way that they were. They don't repeat. Those are the things I think that we tend to resist. Aging, physical changes in the world around us, and the changes that come as a result of new ideas. Did you know that there are still some flat earth people out there? They're pretty well convinced that we live on a flat disk, and can't be reasoned with. It just goes to show you that human beings tend to deny the reality of change and ideas that make them uncomfortable. We fight it. We resist it. We fail to see and to appreciate the inevitability of change. Change is inevitable. There's nothing we can do about the arrow of time moving forward. So when we resist it, we suffer. And sometimes when we resist it, we miss out. We miss out on things that may ultimately benefit us in the change and march of new ideas. I have a few historical examples of how that works. Okay, Western Union in 1876 said, "This telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. The device is inherently of no value to us." Western Union could have had it, right? They could have had it first. Or this next one. Lord Kelvin, who should have known better, says that heavier than air flying machines are impossible. And in about another 20 years, there they were flying around. Next one. Note the date, 1929. Stocks have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. Oops. And then there's this one. Decca Recording Company. We don't like their sound, and guitar music is on the way out. They rejected the Beatles in 1962, forcing them to go ahead and start Apple Records, and the rest is history. And one last one. This is a digital equipment, 1977. They could have had it. There is no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. And if you would have been around in those days and bought a little stock in a company called Apple, oh my, or Microsoft, right? Just if you would have been willing to embrace this new idea and see that change is inevitable and put a little money into it, just imagine what could have happened. And yet we resist and we cringe when we hear that stuff. We laugh, we cringe. Everything changes and what seems to be impossible becomes commonplace. And if we choose to deny that truth, we do so at our own peril. But you know, the fact is that while we tend to deny change and we fight it, we also love it at times, right? We even try to force it at times. I remember in school when it was getting close to recess time, right? Waiting for that recess bell, wanting that to come along, and the bell would go off and we'd welcome that change and we'd go outside and recess time would go by in the blink of an eye, right? And we were back in the classroom, and then there was that last 20 minutes before school let out for the day. I could swear that not only did the clock stop, but it actually would run backwards. That was my perception. Clocks in a classroom are a means of torture sometimes. You know, we want change when we're bored or in an unpleasant situation, and we want everything to stay the same when we're having a good time, right? Time flies when you're having fun, and that watched pot never boils. That's how we sum up our human experience with time and with change, and it can make us crazy. We put ourselves into this double bind. That's what it is, a double bind. We want change, and we don't want change. There's a word for that. It's called ambivalence. Yeah. Simultaneously having opposite or contradictory feelings about the same thing. So let's pause for a moment and remember something that Sean Carroll tells us about dealing with reality. And in this case, we're applying it to dealing with the reality of time. He said, the poet Muriel Rukeyser once wrote, "The universe is made of stories, not atoms." That is absolutely correct. There is more to the world than what happens. There are the ways we make sense of it by telling its story. The vocabulary we use is not handed to us from outside. It's ultimately a matter of our choice. All right, so the reality is time moves in one direction. Entropy is real. Omelets never go back to being whole eggs, and you cannot unmix the cream that you pour into your coffee and stir it up. You can't undo that stuff. So if we accept that time is like that, then the next question is, what is the best, most life-affirming story that we can tell about it? What is the best story that we can tell about it to promote human thriving? That's what it comes down to. How can we reduce the anxiety and the stress that come from trying to resist change, trying to resist something that we can't change? Eric Butterworth was a Unity minister and a best-selling author of several books, and one of them that we still work with today is this one here called In the Flow of Life. And he's got a chapter in that book that's titled Life Comes to Pass. It's all about change. Eric got the idea for the title to that chapter when he was reading a Bible passage which started with the words, "It came to pass." And a little light bulb go on, so he decided to see how many other Bible passages contain that phrase, "It came to pass." Did a little more research and found that it comes up something like 200 times, I think. So Eric turned it into a little play on words. He turned it into a story about time. All these things that happen come to pass. And that insight led to this paragraph where he tells us, life is a flowing experience, and the only certainty is change. In fear and in greed, in joy and in sadness, there is a human tendency to hold on. When life is equated with things or with relationships or with moments of fulfillment, the threat of their loss or change is too much to endure. Thus, the discovery of the flow of life is the greatest awakening of consciousness we can achieve. That's a pretty good story to tell ourselves about time. And Eric talks about fear and greed and joy and sadness, and we can add a lot of other pairs to that list. We could add pain and pleasure, success and failure, winning and losing, and it goes on and on. There's a human tendency to stay stuck in one and try to avoid the other, to resist going on to the next thing. Whether we're stuck in something, we don't move on, or if we're anticipating something, then we miss out on the present moment. So I read that, and I had to stop for a moment to think about what he was actually saying, because we can all understand the human tendency to hold on to the good stuff, right? Everybody wants to hang on to the good stuff when we like how things are going, but do we actually hold on to the bad stuff at times? That's an interesting question. We try to avoid it, but sometimes do we hold on to it? Interesting question. Part of the human condition, I think. Human beings have been telling stories about that situation for thousands of years. Human beings have been telling stories about time for thousands of years. And a great example of one of those stories that really, I think, nails it is the story of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt. It's the defining story of the Jewish people. However, it speaks to everyone on this question of how do we deal with change? How do we deal with the flow of time? So you might remember the beginning of the story. The Israelites are slaves in Egypt, and they wanted to be free. They wanted to go and live in their own land as free people. And as they say, be careful what you wish for, right? Because when we invite change, it's good to remember that we're actually invoking the unknown. It's not a bad thing, it's just something that we need to be aware of. We're invoking the unknown. So Moses leads the people out of Egypt. They're free, but the first thing that happens is the Pharaoh changes his mind and says, no, I really don't want to let them go. Gets his army and decides he's going to chase them down. So they're heading off into freedom, and Pharaoh and his army are coming up from behind them, and out in front of them is the desert, the wilderness, the great unknown. They're caught between the past that won't let go of them, and they can't see the way forward. The way forward is unclear. It's wilderness. Now, do you think that might produce a little anxiety, some stress, a little bit of fear? Oh, yes. Because we can see our lives right now in this old story. What happens when we're being squeezed like this, right? There's something in the past we want to hold on to, but it's gone, it's behind us. And sometimes we wish that things had never changed, even though we're getting what we wish for, right? We're getting a good thing, we're supposed to be moving on to it, and yet we kind of want to look at the past and hang on to it. Freedom doesn't look so great to the Israelites at this point. They saw the Egyptians coming, and they start singing a different tune. Here's the passage. And this is some pretty snarky stuff here, let me tell you. Whoever this author was good at sarcasm. Get this, he says, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Oh. What have you done to us bringing us out of Egypt? What have you done to us giving us what we begged you for, right? What have you done to us bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? I told you so. I told you so, right? They were all saying, leave us alone. We don't want our freedom. Let us stay and serve the Egyptians, right? Nobody was saying that. Nobody was saying that until they get out on the brink of having to enter the unknown and the desert. All of a sudden, oh, now we want to go back and serve the Egyptians. It was terrible, but at least we knew it, and it was comfortable, and it was familiar to us. Better for us to be slaves than to die in the wilderness, they're saying. That's some good stuff. So it's true what Eric was saying about how we have a tendency to hold on to something even when it was unpleasant and harmful. We forget about the unpleasant, harmful aspects. We tend to whitewash the past, and wish that we could go back and embrace it because we don't like facing the unknown, because we don't like the whole idea of change, is what it comes down to. Going backwards seems like a good idea when we face uncertainty. The old ways are comfortable, they're familiar, even though they didn't serve our best interests. Maybe it's not necessarily that we resist change, but it's the unknown that unnerves us, scares us. Fear makes us do strange, strange things. So at this point in the story, Moses does the thing I think that we all need to do at times like this. Now, according to the story, God makes it clear that time does not go backwards. He tells Moses, tell the Israelites to go forward. That's what he tells Moses to tell the people. Tell them to go forward. Keep moving. Keep a-going. Keep flowing, as Eric would say. Work with natural reality. That's the way time works, so cooperate. Work with it instead of against it. Resistance is futile. That's the truth of any challenging situation. Any challenging situation that we're not in control of, resistance is futile. The only way to get out of it is to go through it. Oh yes, if we can change it, but not much we can do about the arrow of time, not much we can do about certain kinds of change. And this same situation I've just described repeats itself several more times in this long story. It was always the same. The going would get tough, and everyone wanted to go back to Egypt. They grumbled and they moaned and they said at least we had plenty of food and water and so on and so forth. And every single time they did that, every single time they mumbled and groaned and wanted to go back to Egypt, all they succeeded in doing was to prolong their discomfort. They prolonged their time wandering in the wilderness. The story says they wandered 40 years. 40 doesn't necessarily mean 40 actual calendar years. 40 is one of those symbolic numbers that we run across in the Bible, which means that you're going to be stuck doing this for as long as it takes to complete the process. Whether that means as long as it takes for you to wake up or to learn the important lesson, 40 years simply means as long as it takes. There's another version of the story that basically says that the whole sojourn in the wilderness ended when Moses finally let his wife go and ask for directions, but that's not the version of the story we're working with today. They had to learn their lesson. They had to learn that the only way to get through the wilderness is to go through it, to move forward. That's what Eric was talking about when he said the only certainty in life is change. When the only certainty in life is change, then the discovery of the flow of life is the greatest awakening of consciousness that we can achieve. So this story of the Exodus tells us, hey, the best way to deal with change is to flow with it. A couple of things that the Israelites learned was that they needed to see it as a process. And then they had to surrender to that process that change always brings. That means letting go of the past, accepting the fact that all change is going to bring a time of uncertainty, a time of wandering in the wilderness, and it will also bring a new beginning. And that's probably the hardest thing to hold on to, is to see that that is around the corner, what that might look like. We don't know what it might look like, but it's going to be there. Every form of change gives us an opportunity to grow into a new situation and state of consciousness. And generally, it's a state of consciousness that's going to serve us better. So time, it's cyclical, day follows night, but time is also irreversible. And there are things that we have to release. Both are true, and it's our stories that help us to remember that so we don't have to keep repeating the same mistakes of the past when it comes to dealing with reality. And those stories actually contain some practical ideas on how to deal with that reality. So Poetic naturalism says we accept the reality of what the scientific method shows us, and then we tell the most life-affirming story about it that's going to help us to deal with that reality in a way that leads to human thriving. And we'll take this topic up again next week. See you then.